knowledge. So if your question is very niche, you can't almost answer any question, but hopefully you'll get a really good discussion about kind of the key tenets of the paper, of which I think I draw out a couple, but the two lovely speakers will speak to in more detail in due course. But the overall argument of the international development white paper is that conflict, climate change, and the COVID-19 pandemic have fundamentally changed the world we live in, and that therefore international development is more important and more difficult than ever before. It argues that development should be focused on alleviating poverty and tackling climate change, which is a new focus, clarity focus for the UK. Within it, there's a focus on equitable relationships, so a change in the dynamics that we've traditionally seen in UK foreign policy. Got the image of global refugees being replaced by focus on partnering with developing nations. There's a big focus on unlocking non-government funding, so it doesn't recommit to 0.7% anytime soon, which probably isn't hugely surprising, but it talks about the reform of market development banks, scaling up IFIs, and better use of pre-arranged financing. It also has the General Development Goals as SMART, which is a new thing, hasn't really been in recent thinking around UK foreign policy. And the other focuses that I think are worth being aware of are conflict and fragility, which is a big focus for David Cameron, who's the new Foreign Secretary. There's a big focus on AI, on women and girls, and also on focusing aid on low-income countries. So just a quick overview, there's a lot more detail on that. Inevitably, that's a few of the kind of key points to think about. And I will now hand over to Olivia for her initial notes.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Stephen and the British Foreign Policy Group for having me. I just get the sense from the aura of this room that there's a lot of expertise that we have. So I'm going to give my takeaway. I'm really looking forward to hearing Ryan's, but then it'd be great to get onto questions, and I welcome people's sort of disagreement or giving us some things you might have missed. For me, I think I'll just go through kind of 4 big takeaways. But before that, I would say I think the white paper is a big achievement and a welcome attempt to recapture a focus on traditional areas of UK need in development, but also areas of critical need. So this focus and target on greater spending, greater investment from British international investment, the development investment arm of the UK government in low-income countries, and this focus on unlocking more finance to help countries manage the green transition and climate change adaptation, I think is very welcome. It's positive to see that. The UK has traditionally been a voice in the G7 for focus on extreme poverty. DFID was very strong at pushing fellow donors and projects and organisations they funded to focus on extreme poverty, and it's an area of critical need. So the International Rescue Committee often quotes this stat that it's only about 20 countries in the world that now represent 90% of people in humanitarian need, 80% of people who are food insecure. Unsurprisingly, most of those countries are also affected by conflict. So this relatively small group of countries where extreme poverty and conflict combine to create real serious insecurity and need for people. I think it's positive that the UK is seeking to focus on that. Kind of in no particular order, big takeaways. I think it's kind of very interesting that the white paper, where the previous international development strategy in 2022, it was very bilateral. It really focused on this idea of the UK relationship with single other countries. The white paper focuses a lot on partnership, but a lot of it is about the system writ large and making the system fairer or work better for low-income countries. So getting international financial institutions to sweat the assets, as people like to say, to make funding go further, release funding for countries in need of support with climate transition, and particularly to manage and make more transparent the process of handling debt distress. I'm really pleased to see that 60% of low-income countries are in debt distress. If you are giving small amounts of bilateral aid to countries in debt distress, you're kind of pouring water into a bucket with a hole in it, right? So it's an attempt to describe the larger problem and make the playing field a bit fairer for low-income countries. The difficult part will be the how. These kinds of papers can't go into detail on exactly how everything will work. Their role is to set a strategic direction. But if you think about the last time, or one of the last times the UK was really at the forefront of pushing to manage debt or drop developing country debt in the 2000s, much of that debt was owned by Western country creditors. Now a lot of developing country debt, about 62%, I believe, is owned by private sector creditors, and that some large proportion of it is owned by China. So we're going to have a trickier time restructuring, managing, helping countries deal with that debt because we have a more complicated playing field. Second big takeaway is actually China, having brought it up. I thought the paper was sort of surprisingly light on China. It has this section on it, but I thought what it said in that actual section was interesting. So I kind of welcome the shift away from language about explicitly competing with the Belt and Road investment, because personally I would thought that was, it's not that we shouldn't be aware of China's growing influence in, for want of a better term, the global south. But the idea that the UK could explicitly compete with those investments never made any sense to me. By some measures, the totality of the Belt and Road investments are worth something like $8 trillion. We don't have that kind of firepower, and we also don't necessarily have the expertise to rival their investments in infrastructure in developing countries. So I welcome the language that was, we need to recognise the reality of China as a development actor and very cautiously and strategically navigate that reality. Again, the difficult thing is the how, but to give the poor civil servants a break, like you can't answer every question in these kinds of documents, but I thought the tone was interesting. Third big takeaway, I thought it was a very short section on public support, and given the emphasis that Minister Andrew Mitchell put on that, I was a bit surprised that there wasn't more on it. I mean, maybe it's just a vexed question, right? So I don't doubt that this paper will probably garner cross-party support. But public support has always been a challenge. There's an Evie and the BFPG know more about this than me and do all sorts of interesting polling, and you can find ways in which the British public in lots of ways support aid, and you get lots of generous giving when there are emergencies. But the 0.7% spending, I think the support for that was always fragile or limited. And some of the things that you see in that section are somewhat, they're kind of retreads of previous things. So it talks about having their international volunteering scheme. The old version of that international citizen service was only shut down in 2020. I'm not sure that's quite the way to garner public support. Those schemes are often for younger people who tend to be more supportive of development anyway. So it feels like they've not quite cracked that question. And I think final takeaway on that note of the international volunteering scheme, there's a few things in here that we've seen before. The section on illicit finance, it's great to see illicit finance in there, but a lot of what is in there I think have been in UK government strategies going back 5, 6, 7, 8 years to the anti-corruption summit. So working with overseas territories, ensuring whole of government response, better resources on anti-corruption. And I think maybe that speaks to, we went through a lot of tumult to maybe in some cases get back to where we were in sort of 2018, 2019 on some of these issues. So positive in some ways to see that we're back there, but question marks about whether that makes the whole merger and the very rapid cuts to the budget, you know, the real question marks about how much time was lost for these quite urgent issues to then come back to a white paper saying some things that were being said 5, 6 years ago. I think those are my big takeaways. So I hand over to Ryan.
Thanks. Well, thanks, Evie, so much for the invitation. It's great to be here. The first thing for me is the fact that David Cameron and Andrew Mitchell have put development back at the heart of foreign policy. That's the biggest takeaway. I'm absolutely delighted at the commitment David Cameron showed. I read in the paper that he stayed up all night, or he did his red box on the first day in office, read the whole thing cover to cover. So he's clearly committed beyond everything that we already know about him. And that's such a contrast with what's gone before, not just having a foreign secretary who passionately believes in development, but having a minister for development who actually believes in it too. That hasn't always been the case in the last few years. So I think for me, that's the number one takeaway, and that gives me lots of hope. The other thing is partnerships being the new leadership. That's the big thing for me, and it's particularly tricky for my organisation because our tagline is UK leadership or something like that. So I'll have to rethink that. But I think it's a really good thing, and I know that we can quibble over the extent to which the UK really means what it said, but I think the fact that that's across every chapter of the white paper says a lot about the direction that we should be going in, and I think that's really powerful too. Unlocking non-government funding for international development is huge too, and again, we can argue over how we do that. I'm definitely not an expert in how we do that, but I think that's realistic and sensible, and it's good to see it in there. It's great that the SDGs are front and centre. I don't think they featured much in the past to the strategy on women and girls and international development strategy before, so it's great that they're in there. And again, we know they're in there not just because they're paying lip service, but because David Cameron chaired the UN meeting which led to the SDG being drafted. So he's really signed up to this, and that's great. And the final thing for me, just picking up on one of Olivia's points, is the nod to public opinion. And I really think this is the big nut for us to crack. And I agree with Olivia that it didn't get nearly as much airtime in the white paper as it deserves. But I just think until we properly work out how to change public opinion on development, the risk is that in 10 years' time, when a new government replaces a new government, if you follow my thinking, we get a remerger of whichever department has been re-established to do development. We see the aid budget cut again, we lose out on another decade of opportunity, and we start all over again. And for as long as the public, and I know that we can look at different polls and all of that, but as long as politicians, particularly those on the centre-right, believe that the public will let them get away with cutting the aid budget and merging DFID, they will be tempted to do it again and again. So I'm glad that there was a nod to it. I get very excited by ideas of volunteer groups because it makes me think of the Peace Corps in JFK's administration back in the 60s. And I think if we are to do that, the real trick will be making sure that it's as inclusive as possible. I mean, well, don't get me wrong, I'll accept anything that moves us in this direction. But I think if we target young people who would have done a gap year anyway, who probably would grow up to be supported in development, that's a missed opportunity. So it has to reach out to regions of the UK where perhaps support for development isn't very strong, among demographics who perhaps, you know, think that their town centre or their local hospital is more deserving of public cash rather than people overseas who will never meet. And the British Foreign Policy Group will know who these people are. It's just a case of us winning that argument and making sure that any move in this direction targets those people.
Brilliant, and thank you both for talking about great opinion, because you know that's something. So I'm gonna just offer a few questions for me, and then we'll open up to everybody else. And one thing we haven't touched on fully yet is what I would like to think about how does this align with kind of the integrated review? Does it match up with the review, the refresh, the development strategy, the women girl strategy? How do all of these align? Do they match up? And does it?
Well, I think if the white paper called something like development in a more competitive world, or a more so it sort of borrows the title from the integrated review, right, which is also uses this phrase, the more competitive world. I think, I mean, I'm very interested in others' take on this, but to me, the thrust of the integrated review and the refresh was we are in a more competitive world. We're in a world shaped by strategic competition between the US and China, but also from kind of hostile or authoritarian states, particularly Russia. And in that context, we need to kind of consolidate our assets. So talking about things like consolidating our leadership in science and tech is all in the context of we're in a difficult world, a competitive world. There are flaws and problems with the multilateral system, with what we might think of as predictable international order. So we have to get a little bit more resilient to paint it in quite broad brush terms. I think what is interesting that although I like a lot of things in this white paper, I next DFID, you know, like it kind of skates over that context. I think, like I said, that the section on China is quite light. Strategies like this are not going to explicitly talk about competition with other systems necessarily. It has quite a standard section on open societies and human rights. So I don't know, it feels a little bit like returning to some key themes of UK leadership in areas where it undoubtedly had real expertise and impact, but it maybe doesn't really. If we take the merger on its own terms, the idea was to realise the benefits of combining a diplomacy department and a development department, and I'm not sure we really see a white paper that actually talks about doing those things in a more competitive world. And that some of it's in there. I thought the section on science and tech had more heft than previous sort of language that I've seen on that. It's genuinely interesting ideas in there. But yeah, I'm not sure it quite realised the potential of the merger. There is some potential there in bringing together development and diplomacy. I'm very aware of all the kind of drawbacks. So yeah, I'm not sure that this white paper does quite fit in, other than borrowing some of the language to sort of sound like they're part of the same family of strategies. It's quite a development-y white paper, and it's not the most, sorry, this is such an ugly term, but geostrategic document. I've had a day to digest it, and if other people think differently, I'm very keen to hear, but that's my view.
Brilliant, I'm positive.
Thanks. I'm slightly more optimistic, but so I think if there are three big trends, I suppose, facing the UK in the diplomatic sphere. I think first is dealing with a rising ambitious China, dealing with a declining Russia. That's the first one. I think the problems about passports, pandemics, climate change, migration, those are sort of bucket number two. And bucket number three is the rise of tech and AI and how we react to that. I think all those things have obviously got a nod in the integrated review and the integrated review refresh, and I think they all got a nod in the white paper. I agree that perhaps not as clearly as we might want them to have been, but I think the fact again that they're there suggests to me that the government is thinking about development in a more integrated way alongside defence and diplomacy, which is what I think is exactly how it should be seen. So yeah, like Olivia, I'll leave to others to weigh in on the extent to which there should have been more or less, but the fact that they featured in the white paper is for me good news, positive.
Actually, can I add one thing? Well, actually, one thing I would say where I agree is you could see, I think, in the white paper some of this thinking about appealing to what they often call the global middle ground in the FCDO. So the kind of emerging economies or countries in the global south who tend to feel somewhat caught between China and the US, are not keen to be forced to choose, are very conscious of, or at least certainly highlight when in diplomatic discussions with Western countries the unfairnesses or the inefficiencies of the international system. So the play to say we need to reform international financial institutions and the international system in various ways so it kind of works better for countries that have definitely lost out. To be fair, I do think there's a kind of strategic element to that, right? If we're sort of somewhat in tension or in competition with other systems or other ways of organising societies, we need to demonstrate that any kind of international order that we have built works, functions for people, and one way you can do that is to practically deliver things like climate finance and aid, but is also to do things like say we should have an African voice in the UN Security Council, which is in there. We should seek to reform the system of the World Bank and the IMF in such a way that they're much more responsive and they sort of are much more responsive to kind of developing countries' needs. So I've somewhat convinced myself there that it's maybe a bit more strategic than initially seemed, but I still feel, having gone through the merger, it could have said more about this is how we're actually realising the benefits of combining these two departments. I'm not sure that's.
Thank you, and I agree on the point around patient diplomacy, which again is dropped off from the language at the moment from the product, so it may reappear. To me, so when I was speaking to the team, they were talking about equitable relationships, so much in the paper as much as I was expecting, but that was kind of the language they were using around development, and I can see the parallels. Patient diplomacy is working with a variety of partners across the world, some of which we like a lot, some of which we will not necessarily align with always, but we will nonetheless kind of cultivate relationships. And similarly, I think the premise behind equitable relationships is we will value all expertise across the world, with all those with all different partners, regardless of kind of the history and the background, to actually build stronger, more relationships built on respect, which also leads me to my next question. Is a buzzword for Lisa and Andy's kind of view on foreign policy. It's all about respect, partnership, women, girls. And I think that's one of the big challenges for a strategy that's released just before an election year is how it will be received by a Labour government. And I don't know, I'll go to Ryan first and then thoughts on how Labour might receive the strategy, will it survive into the next year?
Well, it's really tricky because I'm going to Zambia with Lisa and Andy next week. So if this event was in 2 weeks' time, I could give you a much better answer, but I'll have to guess for now. I think the biggest obstacle when it comes to Labour will be just the very simple facts that if they form a government for the first time in 13, 14 years, regardless of how much they agree with the white paper, and I'm sure there's lots in there to agree with, and I know that Andrew Mitchell has purposely reached out to Lisa and Andy and David Lammy and tried to work with them, and I think they've been receptive too, but I just think basic reality of politics is they'll want to put their own stamp on this, they'll want to do their own thing, and I think they're entirely justified in wanting to do that. So I think there are overlaps. I think the stuff about remittances, which David Lammy's talked about in the past, I think the emphasis on focusing bilateral aid on poorest in the world, I think that will obviously have some overlap. The geopolitical situation is unlikely, but I mean, who knows, but Labour will inherit all the same problems that the current government is having to grapple with. So I don't see great areas of divergence necessarily, but I just think it's unrealistic to expect there not to be a different version of this at some point in the next few years. And I think that's entirely fair. I don't think that reflects badly on Lisa and Andy at all.
Just for there, I'm gonna disagree just to well, I'm not really, but you're quite right. I think it's politically realistic to put that to their own stamp on it. I'm just gonna make the kind of broader plea that it's sort of in some ways I think a shame our system works like that because we have suffered, I think, from a lack of continuity and a lack of kind of strategic focus. We've had such a run of, 7 foreign secretary in 7 years. So I think you're entirely right, they will want to put their own stamp on it, but I do think it's a shame sometimes that we can't have a program where an opposition party gets in and decide like, yeah, actually we will stick with some of this because we agree with a lot of it. I think there's probably a lot of it in there that they wouldn't object to, and it's very wide ranging. And it has, as you say, there's a number of themes in there that they could easily sort of pick up and run with that I think are very squarely in Labour's House. I agree on remittances, the whole focus on lower countries of climate change, and much of the focus on fairness and debt distress and sort of levelling the playing field, which is a lot of the sorts of things that David Lammy talks about, and that more broadly I can't see a lot that Labour would disagree with, whereas sort of the international development strategy or the thrust from a few years ago, I think they would have done. I mean, I think we are sort of due. They might come in and decide to do a whole defence review or a whole kind of integrated review, depending on sort of, how they decide to play their focus on foreign policy. They also will have significant domestic challenges and a really constrained fiscal situation. So in another way, I think there's a way in which we'll see continuity, which is I think they're also unlikely to go back to 0.7% anytime soon, and they're also likely to seek to continue to be pretty fiscally constrained on development, which of course is, I don't think we actually brought up. I mean, the other big thing is that there isn't any new money and they don't actually address governance of money. So I don't think anyone was expecting to say we'll go back to 7% of gross national income, but they also don't, I believe, really address. Unlike they're going to the whole issue of the Home Office spending a large proportion of the budget on refugee accommodation in country, or even the issues around quite the aid budget going to capitalise in British international investment. So long list of priorities and still pretty limited resources, and I think that is another contributing to the Labour.
Brilliant, and agreed. Long list of priorities. If anyone has priority or 149 things, it's quite thorough. Lots of really interesting stuff in there, but very, very long. So yeah, good luck. Really, all if anyone attempts that mountain. I'm now going to open up to the floor because I'm conscious of lots of people here and lots of people have lots of brilliant ideas. And as you were, yes, that would be great, and at the front, that was so quick, I hadn't even finished saying. Keenness to that.
I just want to say, first of all, congratulations on David Cameron winning that seat. I was so excited when I seen it, because my interpretation of everything is more of the lines of him, otherwise it's like what your arguments were. And what I want to say with the Labour thing is it's brilliant. This is a mixed method approach, because Labour will agree with most of what's in the integrated review. Also, what I want to say is I love the fact that he's focusing away from bilateral because they're more biased and he's going into multilateral. Another thing, what I like about it is the fact that he's conservative, not Tory. What I love about the split in the party, he's not going to pass around. I love the fact he resigned. He didn't want to put the question out, we have to go to react it. He put it to the public, they made the choice, he resigned. Oh, principle. I love David Cameron. And I know I really do, because I know he's passionate, I know he's not principled from Marvel. He worked 7 days within being in his position to switch the game around, and I know he's got the ball in his court because he knows what he's going to do. My questions though are about bilateral contact with Ukraine. What are the plans for the economic foreign aid fiscal analysis? The second question would be economic foreign aid in regards to the conflict with Israel and Palestine. I'd love to see how it's going to balance the war with that, because I know it's very, 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 I should say, what's the word, volatile.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Yes.
So yeah.
Great, thank you, Louise, thank you. So I think maybe Israel, Palestine and Ukraine, how these intersect with the strategy, how we can approach the war as well. I'll go to you first, Ryan, if that's okay.
Thanks. I agree with everything you said about David Cameron. I'm also a huge fan. So it's I'm not the only one in the room who, yeah. I think maybe I think it's maybe compared with what has happened since and what went before. I think that's it. I think it's maybe it's in my case it's not that. I think it's really interesting the extent to which we do everything that's in the white paper or aspire to do it, whilst also dealing with life and events. And I think this is the war in Ukraine and the war between or the conflict between Israel and Hamas is a really good example of that and how we navigate it.
Because the inflation I'm worried about, because with the Bank of England and the pressures going up and the cuts with the public funding, and I even researched how many people in Wales, because that's where I'm from and I travelled over from Wales today, how many people in Wales are on PIP, which means they're mentally ill, they're not stable enough to work, they're not mentally fit. And it was more than half, 25,000. And then I seen Jeremy Hunt was already putting the tackle on that, and I think that's beautiful. Why? Because we need a fit economy. How can we not have a population that is not this political stuff is not common knowledge? And I think that is where he needs this. I think David Cameron will be a firm stone to do that, because he's known in politics. But I think he needs to stress this now that he's serious, because there's been so many people, like you said, changing in governments and messing things.
Thank you very much. We'll just go back to the panelists if we can, just to make sure we get to the next question. So Ryan, continue.
So I think there's a broader point actually about how David Cameron will respond to some of these issues. And I think I know my organisation does a lot of work with parliamentarians. That's our value add, I think, to the sector, particularly centre-right skeptics of development parliamentarians, so they tend to mostly come from one party. And I think there was a sense in the first 24 hours after he was appointed that actually he's in the Lords, it's all right for him to stand up and make the case for things like aid and development. He hasn't got to knock on doors on a Saturday and justify why we're possibly cutting some areas of public spending and maybe not doing that in other areas. But I think it's a good thing, actually, to have a foreign secretary who doesn't have to rush back for votes, who doesn't have to nurse a constituency, because even Whitney, under current polling, probably looks a bit ropey. So I think there are a lot of strengths to be taken from Cameron's appointment, notwithstanding the very understandable concerns that lots of his colleagues will have.
Great, thank you. And Julian, quickly on this.
I mean, I don't have loads to add to what you said there. I mean, I think it will be a challenge. We were just saying at the beginning, before everyone came in, that we kind of feel for the civil servants in the FCDO because nothing ever stops. You never get like a nice moment to think carefully about what's your long-term development strategy while they've been seeking to finalise this crisis has erupted in Israel and in Gaza. And speaking of the integrated review, that document and that strategy, quite a lot of that sort of shifted away a bit from real UK diplomatic engagement in this conflict. We have not been massively playing a diplomatic role. We didn't have a Middle East minister for a brief interim there in 2022. We've been seeking to shift our focus, as the US has, towards China, and we've obviously been distracted by the immediate challenges of the war in Ukraine. So I suppose it really just underlines the point of there are no new resources here, and this is the long list of priorities, and understandably government is consumed by quite short-term crises. And we also, I very much appreciate the perspective of David Cameron. But I mean, I would just underline that he's the 7th foreign secretary in 7 years.
He knows his history in politics, and that's what matters.
I do agree with that, but I think it's tricky for anyone to have an effect on them. So it's a difficult one.
Brilliant, thank you. And if we could have a full show of hands if you would like to ask a question, just so we can get a sense of see right at the back. Yeah, as far back as we can go, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Mr. Lopez. I'm from Bristol. I'm originally from Africa, and my concern is if you check now how Africa is moving, especially in the Francophone Africa, previously by my way of speaking, that I'm originally from a Francophone country. So there is a kind of challenge, but there is also kind of opportunities. So in which direction the new Secretary of State will really deal with Africa? Because the vacuum we try to live there in Africa is feeling and feeding by others. And the example of France now was happening for open countries, I think probably we need to learn from that. So in which way?
Right. Okay, thank you very much. And Olivia,
Yeah, can I just kind of answer the question? What the kind of UK's approach to Africa broadly? Yeah. I mean, I think one thing I kind of noted in the paper is that, again, please tell me if I got it wrong, but beyond kind of mentions of partnerships, there wasn't that much about some kind of regional approaches, particularly. You know, there was a period when DFID organised itself around having an Africa strategy, and that was much more the direction of travel. I think the kind of interesting aspects of the paper are, to come back to the theme I was saying earlier, the parts of it that refer to kind of seeking to level the playing field, so seeking to deal with things like developing country debt, where they might have, I think they briefly mentioned it, but where they might have said more is take Ruto, the president of Kenya. He's talked a lot about kind of finance, and he's been very vocal in sort of kind of, you see more him taking a leadership role on these issues. And I think it would be interesting for the UK for the government to have said more in the paper about how are we seeking to swing behind African leadership in some cases, leadership in the Caribbean with Mia Motley on the Bridgetown agenda, something we will be very familiar with. How are we seeking to swing behind the leadership of developing countries who are seeking to sort out these problems in the international system? There were going to be some partnerships, great, but I actually think I could have said more about that. And I think it's interesting that you see more vocal, for example, from Kenya, African leadership on these issues and on trying to address problems of debt or problems with the kind of international system. So I think maybe that was a bit of a gap. Yeah, I think it will be interesting to see if, you know, a lot can happen in a year, but we're all slightly operating with the assumption that currently the Labour Party is 20 points ahead in the polls. If they get in next year, if they take the themes in this white paper, and they use it to develop more specific and focused kind of regional strategies, to look at things like the UK relationship with Africa. I think that'd be
So I think for me, one of the most striking sentences in the white paper was much to learn as well as much to offer. I think when I think of opportunities for engaging with Africa in the years to come, I think there are, if we think about that line, much to learn, much to offer, I think if we're really clear about what it is we can offer, what the UK can offer, then I think there's the basis for much stronger relationships going forward. So I think in the case of Kenya and Nigeria, the security partnerships that we have, for example, are a good opportunity there to build links. The UK is very good at helping to establish strong institutions, for example. So we know that in those countries that will likely to be well received. I think our diplomatic efforts in South Sudan and places like that to help bring about peace could also form the basis for good relationships. And I think what's interesting is, I'm looking down at my notes because it's only been a couple of days, but I think the UK welcoming permanent representation for the African Union at the G20 is not something, to the best of my knowledge, that China or Russia has done. So I think I don't want to oversell it because I don't think those partnership offers are as great as we might want, but I still think there's a lot to work with.
Brilliant. And I do think as well there's something specifically around UK strengths areas, and Louisa does lots of work on education. Big benefit the UK has of its strength in education, finance, these areas. Actually, where we can really benefit developing nations, including in Africa, if we can harness those internationally. Next question, that
Yeah, a short one from you. I haven't read the paper yet, but I understand that there's a lot of talk in partnerships with private sector investors, partnerships with academy, partnerships with science organizations. How do you think the partnership between the government and the professional services companies, like those represented in this group, will be shaped up in the next 6-7 years that this strategy is supposed to last? And how you see companies like us, where some of the expertise and it comes from, will help the government to deliver certain elements of this strategy? Thanks.
Right, so I think the question is, how does the private sector get involved? Ryan, will go first.
Sure. Well, I've always worked for NGOs, with NGOs, so I'm not very knowledgeable about how it's worked in the past. What tended to happen prior to, let's say, 2018, was that on a monthly basis, the Minister for Development or the BFPG secretary beforehand would usually meet with the CEOs from the big British NGO community, perhaps not on a monthly basis, that's maybe how it once was, but perhaps just a bit more infrequent towards the end. But it tended to be a real dialogue, and I think that shifted in recent years to more of a box tick exercise. And I'm doing a service to some of those ministers, but I think certainly for some, that's what it was. They wanted to be able to say, we've engaged with civil society. But when it was a proper dialogue, I think it really worked. And in the case of the NGOs, they were able to do what NGOs are supposed to do, which is use their prophetic voice or speak truth to power, whatever you want to call it, and really speak on behalf of their members up and down the country who care passionately about the rights and well-being of the world forest. I think what I'm trying to get to is, I think what should happen, if it's not happening already, and it may be, I just wouldn't know because my background's a bit different, is for the private sector to having those same conversations. They'll obviously take a different shape and different form. And I'm sure, knowing Andrew Mitchell as I do, that he would already have set that ball rolling over the past year, and I'm sure David Cameron would be interested in that too. So for me, that's it. I think the private sector should be going to government and saying, this is what we can offer, this is what we think we can do, this is what we've got the resources to do. I think that's in everyone's interest. I'm sure that would be continued under a Labour government too.
I certainly agree with that. I think the only thing I would add is more broadly in terms of sort of the international private sector. I do think there's some plenty of interesting stuff in the paper on that, particularly when it comes to climate change and the green transition. So there's a reference to this these funding deals, the Joint Energy Transition Partnership, that some people might be familiar with, which the UK kind of spearheaded when it hosted COP a couple of years ago. Just this idea that, you know, a group of developed countries form a kind of coalition with middle income countries, particularly, who need to make that green transition, need to move away from fossil fuels, and seek to support them, facilitate, crowd in the private investment that is required to do that. There are lots of things that aid is just not going to do, and that is particularly on climate transition. I think the paper has a welcome emphasis on how can we unlock the investment that low-income countries and middle-income countries need. As ever, it's difficult to say how, because I think this has been an emphasis for a long time, and finding ways to sort of de-risk private investment in middle and lower income countries is always a challenge. It's what British international investment often seeks to do by being the first investor and then hoping others will follow. So it's a difficult one, but I think we cannot shy away from what many countries need, especially to support a green transition, is significant private investment. And I think there's a good emphasis on, okay, what role then can development from aid play in unlocking that? But that has been a challenge for a long time. So I agree, one of the best ways to probably try to continually invest is a good dialogue between private sector and development actors and FCDO and that kind of thing. So I hope that's cool.
And one really quick thing from me, just jumping in on that, is around soft power. So, British Foreign Ministry Group run the UK soft power group with the British Council. We bring together big institutions across the UK that are representing the UK internationally, contributing or not. They're big, you know, companies, some of them are cultural, some of them are sports, some of them are business, some of them are education, a real variety. And what we do is bring kind of those groups together, and we're really welcome this time. The Royal did bring us into the international development strategy on soft power and was thinking consciously about, okay, how are these organisations representing us internationally? How are they actually doing a lot of development work already within internationally? They were recognising soft power institutions as a partner, and you see that reflected in the strategy, and that's a really welcome development. And from our side, we a real opportunity for the parts to play a role, is kind of frame this as soft UK soft power. Yeah, Louisa's really the charge.
Thanks very much, Richard, through BSI. I wondered if you could sort of apply the strategy white papers to next year, and what you think will look different as a result in the next year because of the white paper, and what should we expect to happen in the world of UK international development anyway, irrespective of the existence of the white paper.
Brilliant and very challenging question. You'll have the answer to it first, again.
I'll give it a go, but don't hold me to my predictions. I mean, I think it's a very good question, because a lot of these kind of government documents, it's a challenge to write them, because it's difficult to say what concretely will be different in the world because of this. And I think some of it is setting a strategic direction for the department and the rest of government to follow, and the details will have to be worked at that level. But I think some of the targets in there are pretty concrete. So the refocusing bilateral spending on low-income countries, and the targets of British international investment to invest more in low-income countries. And I think what they ultimately said is, regardless of how much aid we're spending all together, we want 0.2% of gross national income to be spent in low-income countries. So those are pretty concrete targets. I don't know how quickly they'll move to them, but that says to me that this refocus on the poorest countries and low-income countries, those are real. You know, there's something to be held accountable to and something to be held to there. And I think that suggests then that's probably where I would look for shifts. I think the other I'm slightly retreading things I said, sorry, I apologize, but like the focus on kind of debt distress in reforming the international system, I would be interested to look for whether the UK is sort of advocating for that at things like World Bank Spring meetings, at, you know, the kind of geopolitical calendar as part of the G7. They talk a bit about the G20. The other interesting thing they talk about is more partnerships with Gulf countries. People always talk about the Gulf countries as these wealthy countries. Can we kind of unlock that more so that they are bigger players in aid and bigger players in funding and supporting people in distress and extreme poverty in their region. So I would look at the way whether the UK brings that into its kind of diplomatic relationships with those countries. And yeah, whether in what ways the UK seeks to then bring this diagnosis of the problem to international financial institutions and the international system at each of these at the kind of traditional geopolitical meeting points, right? I mean, I would note that we've set these ambitions, but this year our Prime Minister to go to the UN General Assembly, so let's see what happens next year, because a lot of this reforms of the international system in this way requires some pretty significant diplomatic heft, right? Requires showing up and being there and being part of the discussion. So those are things I would look for, not necessarily predictions.
And just on that, and I'll pass it to Ryan, the next question for him, which is what I really struck me in the white paper is the focus on climate change, which given that the government has rolled back on lots of its climate change ambitions domestically, does that mean we still care internationally? Can we still speak in the next year authentically on climate change, or is that going to be a challenge in kind of
No, I think it will be a challenge. I really do. I think you struggle to, if you produce a 140-page paper full of big ambition and don't fund it properly, you're going to be called out on that. And I think the same could apply to climate as well. We don't need to, I'm sure we don't need to rehash the 0.7 stuff, we're probably all upset about that. But I think going back to the broader question, the big challenge I see is if growth in the UK remains flat, then by the government's formula for getting back to 0.7 and by Labour's too, which has adopted it, I don't see how we can get back to 0.7 and properly fund everything that the white paper wants to fund. So I think that's tricky. And I think this plays on climate change as well, but to broaden it out a bit, so much of the white paper talks about partnerships and support for the multilateral system, which is great. But if we look at the polls in the United States, there may well be a president who is, almost, the biggest opponent of multilateralism that's ever sat in the White House. So how does this white paper interact with that? I think that's a challenge. And finally, in keeping with the lack of growth, because I think that's relevant, public opinion still isn't shifting. I mean, I'll wait for Evie's next report. Maybe it has, but I suspect, given everyone's fed up with the public spend, but just cost of living crisis, I suspect it probably hasn't. And so those are the big issues that I would worry about when we think about how the white paper will be start to be implemented.
Ready for the question around the United States. Louisa, who are we going to next?
Thanks very much. I've continued to research at Chatham House and focus on the MENA region. With the return of David Cameron, it's been notable to see what a different set of institutions he's coming back to, right? With split, with what's been a pretty bumpy transition, it's been fair to say, and engaging with the FCDO, it's been pretty clear that there are quite a lot of unresolved battles and some questions over the direction of where things should go. So the last question was really important. Perhaps you covered some of the ground I was looking to ask you about, but the question is here, when something which looks a bit more at home in kind of different space, how does that come out of the FCDO now on kind of bureaucratic level? Because when we engage, it's not clear. It was noted earlier that the split was, or the merger, sorry, was supposed to realise the benefits of combining the agencies, but it's pretty clear that it's not obvious to those within it how to do that. So when something comes through with these types of directives, how will that interact with political initiatives, noting, for example, in the Middle East, or what may or may not happen with the engagement in Gaza and the aftermath, because that's quite hard to work out from someone who spent a lot of time researching the Middle East, but often I'm more confused by British government positions about things that happen in the region.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm conscious that we've not got that long, so we'll take a second question at the same time and we'll answer them together. I think there was one just second.
Yes, thank you very much. I must confess I'm not a member of the David Cameron fan club, but I did actually skim the paper last night, and I may be wrong, but my big impression is that it fails to address the fact that the world order is changing as we speak. Russia is becoming quite powerful in Africa. If you read what it says, it hinges on the fact that we are goodies because we were not a colonial power, and they're investing quite a lot of infrastructure and work in there. Not much money, but influence indeed. And I just wonder whether or not you feel that BRICS is also changing. BRICS is expanding by an extraordinary number of countries when you look at it. Do you not feel that it's a little bit out of date? It doesn't address what is really happening in the world?
You can, yeah, use it.
Well, I'll leave, if it's all right, most of the question about the FCDO did emergency. A former did stuff. But I didn't set out to bang the drum for David Cameron, I promise. But I was going to say this: when it comes to the Middle East, I mean, there'll be people here from the diplomatic service, I'm sure, who might think otherwise. But for me, he's now got to be the most senior foreign minister around any table. I mean, Anthony Blinken might have more clout representing the world superpower, but no one surely has as much experience as he does. And so I think that can only be a good thing. But I'll leave the intricacies of the merger to Olivia. And in terms of sort of emerging world order, I think that's always a challenge with dictators, isn't it? That the integrated review was published, I think, before the invasion of Ukraine, and so you've got to feel sorry for John Yu and all the others who spent so much time working on it. But you have to have a strategy at the same time, don't you? I think the challenge will be in years to come will be how genuine is the UK about bringing into the fold emerging powers like Brazil, India, and representatives from the African Union. I think I was listening to a debate last week where the questions went along the lines of, well, we don't really like Modi, we're a bit concerned about what's happening politically in Brazil. And I think at some point we've probably got to sort of think to ourselves, well, if we're serious about equity and genuine partnerships, then we've probably got to be more accepting of countries as they are rather than as we might want them to be. Very easy for me to say. I don't have to work with it, but I think that debate is probably still to be had. I mean, something else.
Thank you, and thanks for the question about. I mean, to your point on the world order, you expressed better than me what I was trying to say about the paper. Not that, not as kind of strategic as it can be. Like, it's not necessarily addressing what was apparently the diagnosis of government strategy in 2021 with the integrated review. We're in a much more competitive world, a shifting world, authoritarian, and in some cases hostile states, in Russia's case, are accumulating influence. And we need to be quite agile and kind of on the TV about that. Having said that, I think strategies that seek to very explicitly counter, say, China's influence are not necessarily realistic, because we don't necessarily have just the wealth to do that. So we have to think about other ways that we can do that. I think you can see flickers of it in this white paper, because there's, I think, a strategic underpinning to what they're saying about we have to address the problems with the kind of international order that we built post-1945 institutions are not working for poorer countries. So there's a kind of reform to preserve argument. But I agree with you that it's a little bit, it's more developmental than it is strategic and diplomatic. Maybe that's the right thing with limited resources and just focus on extreme poverty and deliver and extreme need. But I do, it's not an easy one to resolve, but I do agree with you that there's kind of less of that diagnosis of a more competitive world in there than I maybe would have accepted. On the merger, hello. I mean, I can like over a drink, I complain about this, but I think it's you can absolutely merging any machinery of government change, merging any departments is difficult. Taking it on its own terms I don't personally object to the idea that you might be able to realise benefits by combining your diplomacy offer and your development offer in various ways, particularly on vexed global governance issues like climate change, for example, where you've got to have a diplomatic relationship and think about the private sector and think about how you're going to address extreme poverty, and you know, a lot of things go together when it comes to our approach to working with others on climate change, as an example. I think just on the nuts and bolts bit, you can see the joins in the new department, right? And it can just be very obvious when you're dealing with this sort of formative part of it and a former foreign office part of it. I think often with these kind of just nuts and bolts of how government works stuff, what you need is really strong ministerial leadership, and you will get civil service kind of pointing in the right direction. And so I'm going to circle all the way back around and be a bit more positive about David Cameron. It is good to have an experienced minister with a commitment to a particular agenda, and then some of the stuff about the IP doesn't talk to each other or whatever can be overcome, right? Because you have momentum and you have leadership. So I think that's actually what would be good to see, and that's why I do hope if Labour get in a year, they don't completely rejig everything and they pick up some things from this white paper, and we have a consistent focus on some of these big headline points. Yeah, I hope that's helpful. I don't know if that solves sort of how to engage with the SCDO, but that's a bigger question.
Can I just say that thing?
Sorry, we're gonna have to close because of time, and I don't want to keep anyone beyond our panelists' time, sorry, but hopefully you can speak to our panelists after. Thank you very much, that was a lovely way to close. Maybe we do love David Cameron, maybe we don't. I didn't expect to talk about David Cameron, so probably, we never know how events will turn out. Thank you very much to our speakers, and thank you to all of you for coming. If you do want to take a look more about the white paper, the vehicle to have on a blog, up on our website, do read it. Thank you very much. Hope it will be useful, and yeah, please join in a round of applause to our.
Very good.